Brethren, one thing that the Bible commands us all as Christians, and even throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, is we are clearly commanded to be servants to our fellow man, to our fellow brethren, and even just our fellow man. We're commanded in many cases throughout the Bible that if we see our brother in need, that they have some physical need that they have, and we have the ability to help them with that, that we're commanded to do that. But that's one of our responsibilities, is to be a servant and to be helpful, to others wherever we can. However, if we don't exercise wisdom in how we fulfill these commands, sometimes even from good intentions, when our desire is to be helpful and edifying to others, we can wind up accomplishing the opposite. We can wind up having our actions be destructive to others, even destructive to ourselves, not out of any malicious ill intent, out of a desire to do good. But again, if we don't exercise wisdom in how we do this, sometimes again, we can accomplish the exact opposite of what we intended to do in the first place. So, what I'd like to do today is to talk about this particular subject. So, if you'd like a title for this sermon, it's Being a Balanced Servant. Again, being a balanced servant. Because again, as Christians, we're commanded to be servants, to our fellow man. But again, if we don't exercise wisdom in doing this, sometimes we accomplish the exact polar opposite of what we were intending to accomplish. And just this particular sermon today comes by special request. I got a phone call from a church member probably a couple months ago, and this individual, in a conversation I was having with them, mentioned to me that sometimes they feel like in their lives they kind of can get this subject out of balance. Sometimes in taking too much on, trying to be serving to others, and they asked me if I would give a sermon on it. So I promised them I would. So today I'm going to try to fulfill that and cover this particular subject. And as I mentioned, we're commanded numerous times throughout the Bible that as Christians, one of our responsibilities is to be servants to others and to help out others wherever we have the ability to do so. So let's first of all just take a moment to look at a few of the scriptures that directly command us this and see that this is a very important subject to God. So let's turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15. And we're going to start reading in verse 7. So if there is among you a poor man of your brethren, within any of the gates in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart, nor shut up your hand from your poor brother, but you shall open your hand wide to him, and willingly lend him sufficient for his need, whatever he needs. Beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of release, is at hand, and your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And you cry out to the Lord against you, and it become a sin against you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. For this is the thing: the Lord your God will bless you in all your works and in all which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and needy in your land. And see, from the very beginning, when God's working with ancient Israel, he's commanding them that this is something that's your responsibility. Now, you're held accountable that if you have the ability to help your fellow man and you see them in need, you should do so. You should be willing to help them. In fact, we're told in the New Testament, if we're not willing to do this, we can't claim to have the love of God in us. So let's turn over to 1 John chapter 3, and let's notice this. 1 John chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 16. So, by this we know love, because he laid down his life for us, that we also ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. But whoever has this world's goods, and sees his brother in need, and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. In other words, we show that we have the love of God in us. One of the ways we illustrate that is our willingness to help out our fellow brethren, or help out our fellow man when we see them in need. We can't just look at Christianity as this intellectual thing of just, what I believe and what I understand, and it's about knowledge. Because we can't just make the claim that, well, me and God are good and tight. I love him and we have a good relationship. It's just other human beings I can't stand, and I can't tolerate. Well, it doesn't work like that. We demonstrate our love for God, in showing love for our fellow man, and be willing to help them. It's an important thing. And we can't claim that we have the love of God if we're not showing love to our fellow man. In fact, it's one of the important criteria that we're judged on to determine whether we make it in the kingdom of God or not. If you'll turn over to Matthew chapter 25, we can see this. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. And as we go through this, I want you to just notice the criteria that, in Christ is separating the sheep from the goats here, what criteria he uses in making this discernment. In verse 31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him. And he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. But now notice the focus of, the issue he's using as a criteria to separate one from the other. Verse 33, and he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on his left. And the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Then he will also say to those on the left hand, depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they will also answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these I will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteousness to eternal life. I notice he said, if you didn't do it to them, you didn't do it to me. And again, that kind of makes my point I was saying earlier. We can't just look at it like I love God, and we have a great relationship. It's just other people I can't stand and tolerate. It doesn't work like that. We demonstrate our love for God by show our love for other people. And again, that's not all that it's entailed in that, but that's certainly one of the important ways that we demonstrate that in our actions. So again, that's very clearly something that we as Christians are commanded to do, is to be willing to help our fellow man, and when we see them in need. However, we've got to do this with wisdom. Because as I mentioned before, sometimes we can go about this, again, with good intentions, not out of any malicious desire to cause any harm to anybody, and we're trying to be helpful, but sometimes if we don't go about it in a wise manner, we can wind up accomplishing the exact opposite of what we set out to do, because we can wind up harming others and ourselves when what we intended to do in the first place was to be helpful. And see, what we have to realize, first of all, is that we basically just have a basic human nature that is deceptive to us. That oftentimes what we think is the right thing to do, oftentimes isn't the right thing to do. And we particularly on this subject have to be aware that our emotions can deceive us. Because oftentimes we can go and approaching this subject, and if we're thinking with our emotions and sometimes not sitting back and logically, analytically looking at a subject, we can go about it again with seemingly good intentions, but accomplish the exact opposite of what we intended to do. So let's first of all just kind of notice some basic scriptures that tell us about our human nature. Turn to Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 25. So there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. I notice this tells you, that this is not talking about someone who was setting out to do, bad things, that was setting out to try to be destructive. That no, it seemed like it was right. So this is something where a person was taking actions with, good intentions, but it didn't turn out right, but because they accomplished the exact opposite of what they had in mind. And we have to be aware that that's just inherently part of who we are. I mean, we have to be aware of those pitfalls that we can fall into. And particularly again on this subject, how our emotions can deceive us. So let's turn over to Jeremiah 17 and notice that not only do we just have faulty thinking as carnal human beings, but we have a deceptive nature. We have a mind that can lie to us, and deceive us. And again, for that reason, we think we're doing good, but we're doing the opposite, but we don't realize it. And it's Jeremiah 17 and verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And again, this can be particularly true if we allow ourselves to think with our emotions. Because at times we can get carried away with them and think that we're doing a good thing when actually our actions are going to end in destruction, and something negative. But we didn't set out to maliciously try to do something negative. We were just deceived by our own emotions. And the reason I kind of make that particular point, as we go through this subject today, we're going to look at a number of applications of this subject of how we can, set out to be a servant, but we can do it in unbalanced ways, and we can wind up, creating the opposite of what we intended. And again, we're certainly not going to cover every example that you could possibly cover on this subject today. There's no way we can do that in an hour, but you can kind of apply a lot of the principles we're going to talk about to more, more subjects than we're going to address. But there's a common theme that you're going to see throughout everything we talk about today. And that's oftentimes our emotions deceiving us, where we're basically taking an action really to make ourselves feel better about ourselves or to appease someone else's emotions, but we haven't sat back and looked at it from a more analytical perspective to say, what is the end result of this action? And does it lead to good, or does it wind up being harmful and destructive in the long run? And see, oftentimes the way we can get down this road is sometimes we have a faulty definition of what love is. Because oftentimes we tend to look at the subject of love, honestly, from what I like to call asking the wrong question. Because we look at it from the perspective of asking the question, does it feel good? Because sometimes we have a definition of love in our heads that, well, love is positive, and it's good and it makes people feel happy and takes away pain and makes everything happy and joyful at the moment it's happening. And that can be a very deceptive definition of love. Because if we look at how God defines love, he doesn't define it with the question, does it feel good? It's more accurately defined with the question, does it do good? In other words, ultimately in the long run, what does this result in? What are the fruits of this in the long run? And to see that clearly, turn over to John chapter 3. We're going to see an example that the Bible uses as kind of one of the ultimate expressions of love. And as we look at this, I want you to think about this from these questions of, does it feel good or does it do good? Because if you ask the question, does this feel good? There's nobody in this equation who's having a warm, fuzzy, positive, feel-good day as a result of what we're about to read here. But it's described in the Bible as one of the ultimate acts of love. And the reason it's described that way is because it does good. Let's notice in John chapter 3 and verse 16 here. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. Now, what we're talking about here is, God the Father sending Jesus Christ down to earth to be a physical human being, to then be falsely accused of crimes he didn't commit, to be falsely arrested, tortured, and then murdered for something he didn't deserve at all in any way, shape, or form because he never sinned. And a father who had to watch all of this, having the power to stop it the entire time, but has to sit back and just watch this injustice happen, knowing it, again, it's for the ultimate good of everyone involved. And again, if you think about it, does this feel good? Well, we won't take the time to go through Matthew chapter 26. But if you read through that, you can very, very clearly see what Christ is feeling through all of this. This is even before all the ugly stuff actually happens. This is just Christ's anticipation of it taking place. And he is begging multiple times, please, Father, if there's some other plan B, if there's some way I can skip this, can we avoid this whole ordeal? Because he knows this is going to be ugly and agonizing. There's nothing, nothing warm and fuzzy and positive about this. But he submits to it, and the Father, again, allows all this to happen. Why? Because it does good. Because it accomplished good for everyone in the long run. Nobody was having a warm, fuzzy, positive day when it was taking place. So again, we have to look at love from that perspective, because oftentimes if we start with that flawed definition of love and you try to build on that concept, you come to flawed conclusions, because you'll have a very skewed picture of things because you're expecting that love's always going to feel good. And that is a very, very flawed definition. Well, now let's start applying all of this to the subject I mentioned. And we're going to look at the whole issue of helping our fellow man, our fellow Christians, in times when we feel that they're in need. But again, we have to go about this with wisdom, because as I mentioned, sometimes we take into actions, and sometimes we're just appeasing our own emotions, and we don't realize that, and our actions can wind up being very destructive to others, and the opposite of what we intended to do. So let me start off kind of giving you some examples of this. And this is something I've had to deal with, quite frankly, my entire life. And to give a little background to this, let me just kind of back up and kind of build a foundation for here. Now, if you've never met me in person, and your only experience with me is seeing a sermon that you've watched on our website or off of a DVD, and you always see me standing behind a podium, you may not even be aware of this. But I walk with forearm crutches. And that's because I was born with a disability called spina bifida that I've dealt with my whole life and lived a very active life in spite of it. But it's something that any stranger that sees me from across the room, doesn't know anything else about me, can immediately look over and say, well, that guy's on crutches. He has some kind of disabling condition. Well, that's true. That's what I like to refer to as a visual disability. Now, realize when I refer to a visual disability, I'm not in any way referring to impaired eyesight. I'm not referring to blindness or anything of that nature. I'm referring to the concept I just mentioned. Where a stranger can see you across a room, know nothing else about you, and they say, well, okay, well, that person's got some kind of disabling condition they deal with. Well, if you have that type of situation, a concept that you will wind up dealing with regularly all throughout your life is a concept I like to refer to as the self-appointed hero. Now, well, what I mean by the self-appointed hero, this is an individual who sees you, again, maybe a stranger sees you across the room, and you're in the process of doing something. And that person decides you need their assistance. Now, you didn't request their assistance. They didn't come up and ask you if you wanted their assistance. They just decide that you need it, and then they charge over to proceed to give it to you. And oftentimes, even if you repeatedly tell them, no, thank you, appreciate the offer, but got it under control myself, they're oftentimes very resistant to hearing that. I mean, literally to the point that I would often describe them as being deaf to the word no. Because you can tell them no numerous times, and they'll ignore it. It's like having a conversation with an aggressive telemarketer. I'm sure all of you at some point have gotten a telemarketer on the phone, and they're trying to sell you, whatever their product is, and you're not really interested in what their product is. But regardless of how many times you try to nicely tell them, no thanks, I'm happy with the service I got, don't really want that. They have a pat response of just dismissing whatever you say, and they keep charging forward. Well, these conversations play out very much the same way. And to kind of give you a picture of some of the magnitude of the issues this can cause, throughout my lifetime, numerous times, people will ask me because they see I have a disability, and they ask, well, what's the greatest, challenge you deal with? What's the greatest problem you're dealing with? And they're expecting me to list some kind of physical obstacle. They're expecting me to say, well, stairways or steep hills or, so some type of issue like that. And that's never my answer. And again, I've lived with that all my life. I know how to manage those issues, are easy enough to manage. My answer is always, without question, it's always the self-appointed hero. Now, let me give you some examples so you kind of see how this can play out. And then I'm going to kind of explain to you the psychology of what's going on behind the scenes in this situation. And that we can extrapolate this to all sorts of examples other than just specifically what I'm talking about here. But to share with you a true story, this happened about, I want to say 30 years ago, probably. I was a student at Ambassador College at the time. This was in Big Sandy, Texas. And if you've ever seen the Big Sandy campus, it's kind of this, large sprawled out campus there. And there was, on one side of campus, there was this particular classroom had a long sidewalk that led up to it. And kind of in the middle of this sidewalk leading up to it, there was this big, huge tree that was literally like right in the path of the sidewalk. I mean, so much so that the sidewalk led up right towards it, forked out on both sides in a diamond shape around it, came back together on the other side, and continued on towards the class. Well, this big tree gave lots of shade around this whole sidewalk area, which was great in the warm summer temperatures. But when it rained a good bit, you could see that, not only did the sidewalk get all wet with this, but, the leaves would fall out of this tree and tree sap would kind of wash down, from this and dirt off the leaves. So you get kind of a muddy, slippery mess, around here between the leaves and the tree sap and the water and everything else that was there. But this was something I was familiar with. I was on this campus for several years and had managed this many times. Well, one particular day I'm headed to class and it's kind of lightly misting rain. It had rained a lot heavier earlier that day, so everything's thoroughly wet, but it's only kind of lightly misting at that point. And I'm headed towards this particular classroom. Now, there's a student that sees me. He's kind of off to my right in the distance and sees me walking, and I don't have an umbrella with me. Because again, it's not really raining that heavily. I'm just trying to get to classes, as quickly as I can. Well, this guy has an umbrella. So he comes running over. He's going to try to be helpful to share his umbrella. And again, I don't fault him for that by any means. But as I see him running up, I immediately know this scenario is headed for trouble. This is not going to be good. And the reason I know that is for two reasons. One, I see the size of his umbrella. Now, he's got an umbrella typical of what a college student would have. It folds up really small. It's very practical to carry around. And when you open it up, it's barely big enough to keep one person dry. You're not going to really get two people underneath this thing. Well, as he's charging over next to me, I know what he's about to do. He's going to try to get both of us underneath this umbrella, to try to protect us from the rain, which means he's going to walk as close to me as he possibly can. He's going to attempt to be my Siamese twin. This is going to inherently make him a trip hazard. Because I walk with crutches, I may have a wider stance with this. And this is also a slippery surface I need to be careful on. So this is the last thing I need. The other thing I know is just from experience, he's likely to make the same mistake that lots of people make when they're around someone like me who's on crutches. And that's if you make a move that they interpret that you might be about to stumble, they instinctively grab your arms. Now think of that as the logical equivalent of I'm going to help my buddy, to keep him from tripping, and I'll do that by tying his shoelaces together. Because think about that. You take someone there with their right and their left foot and you tie the shoelaces together. Have you helped them from tripping? No, you've pretty much guaranteed they're going to trip, because now they can't move their feet like they need to balance themselves. And you're not a help, you're a problem, Well, so I know what he's going to do is, on this slick surface, if I make a sudden move, he's probably going to grab my arms. He's going to create the problem. So I know as he's running up, he's not going to be the solution to the problem that he thinks he is in his head. To put it bluntly, he's going to be the problem, and sure enough, that's what happens. So as he comes charging over next to me, I'm trying to be, I know he's a nice guy. He just saw someone without an umbrella. He's trying to be friendly and, share what he has. He has good intentions, and I'm trying to spare his feelings, So he comes running up to me, and I try to nicely tell him, no, thank you. Got it under control. Just leave me alone. Let me go to class. Regardless of how many times I try to nicely tell him no, he refuses to hear this. So just like I expected, within a few, seconds after this, he's managed to trip me. Now I'm sliding down on the sidewalk. It's wet with leaves and dirt that's washed down, tree sap and everything. So now I'm getting filthy. I could have been just lightly wet from a lightly misting rain, no big deal. Now I'm really getting dirty. So I stand back up to my feet. I nicely tell him, please go on to class. Let me handle this. It'd be better that way. He will not hear that. This plays out a couple more times. Now I'm completely filthy. I'm totally irritated. My patience and my tact is gone, and now I just raise my voice and I very assertively command him to go away. This is the first time he listens to anything that I've had to say through this entire exchange. Because realize in his mind, he's the self-appointed hero. He thinks he needs to come in, take charge, and save the day. He's the last person who even understands what needs to happen in this situation, but that's what he's thinking in his mind. Now, again, his intentions are, he wasn't trying to come up here and cause a problem. He was trying to be a nice guy. He saw someone in the rain without an umbrella, thought, I have an umbrella, I'll share. I don't fault him for that. Nor do I fault him for the fact he didn't understand the dynamics of why this would be, destructive rather than helpful. What I fault him for is he refused to listen to anything that I ever said to him. And because of that, he didn't solve a problem, he created one. I could have walked into class again, just a little bit wet from misting rain that would have evaporated. Now I'm utterly filthy. you know and this is the kind of thing, again, if you're in my situation where you have what I call a visual disability, this is the common thing where people want to charge in and do this. Now, you go through a few experiences like the one I just gave you, you learn to be a lot more assertive on the front end, and you don't let people escalate it to this level. But let me help you understand also kind of what's going on behind the scenes. Because as I mentioned, I don't fault this guy for, he didn't come into this scenario thinking I'm going to be mean and go cause a problem. That's not what he was thinking. He saw someone without an umbrella and thought, well, I have one, I'll share. You know, but there's also another dynamic that's taking place here as well. Now, let me share with you another story to kind of illustrate that. Fast forward a few years, and I've already graduated from AC, now living in the Dallas area. I was asked to guest lecture at the University of North Texas. Now, this is a university where I got my master's degree from, and I was actually asked to guest lecture to a group of students that was in it was a graduate class of students that were, pursuing a master's degree in counseling. And then in this particular class, make a long story short, it kind of focused on, a lot of different unique populations, and issues that, counselors might deal with them. And it was kind of designed to help them understand, different populations and unique things they might face. Well, I was asked to come in and speak on the day they were talking about, clients with disabilities. So I'm, kind of presenting on the subject, and I talk about this whole phenomenon of the self-appointed hero and the problems that this can create. Now, let me be clear about the context of what took place here prior to the exchange I'm about to share with you. Now, what led up to this, the guy asking the question I'm about to tell you about, was me telling the same story I just told you here about the sidewalk in Big Sandy, along with a couple of other examples. Now, what all of them had in common was a situation where, again, an individual I would refer to sarcastically as the self-appointed hero is charging into a situation to provide assistance they think is needed, but the person they're trying to help is repeatedly telling them, no, thank you, don't want this, please move on, but they're being ignored, and this person's forcing help upon them. That was the common factor in every one of these stories. Now, with that in mind, as after I tell all of this, there's a student in the class that raises his hand and he asks a question. And he looks at me, and I could see he's kind of, struggling to process everything, that I have just kind of laid out for them with, his past background, everything he's been taught. And he looks at me and he says, growing up as a Boy Scout, you're taught you're supposed to help other people. You see somebody else in need, it's your duty, as a good person, you go out of your way and you provide assistance for them. He goes, and if you see somebody that you think needs help and you don't go help them, he goes, you feel bad inside. You feel like you've done something wrong. And I could see he's kind of struggling to kind of process all of this. So I stopped and I looked at the guy and I said, sir, let me ask you a question. I said, you mentioned that you feel bad inside if you don't take action and do something. Can you tell me what emotion you're talking about? What is that feeling? Now, I already know what he's going to say, but I want him to say it because I want him to think this through. And he stops and he goes, well, I guess I'd have to say it's guilt, which is exactly what I expected him to say. And I said, okay, let me ask you another question. If you see someone you think is in need, and you offer assistance to them, I said, and they tell you no, thank you, they don't want it. They make it pretty clear they don't want it. And I said, but you force it on them anyway because it appeases that sense of guilt within yourself. Is that really an act of service? And he stopped and he thought about it, and I could see he was mulling this over. And you could see the moment when the realization hit him, because you could see it in his eyes. If he'd been a cartoon character, the next frame would be a light bulb going on over his head, because you could see that, his eyes kind of light up, and he goes, I guess since you put it that way, I guess it's not. And I said, no, sir, it isn't. I said, because you've offered them something. You've done your part in offering assistance to them, and they've told you no, they don't want it. And I said, you're forcing it on them is not to help them, it's to make you feel better about yourself. I said, because you're totally disregarding them. I said, it's not an act of service, it's an act of selfishness. I said, it just masquerades as an act of service because that's what we're telling ourselves, is that, we're doing this good thing and I'm a good person. Even, when this person is directly telling you, I mean, there's no question here, they're looking in you in the eyes telling you this is not good. I said, and you're ignoring it. I said, and see, that's something we have to think about when we look in terms of acts of service with others. Are we doing something that's really going to be beneficial and helpful to the other person? Or are we completely ignoring everything they're saying, forcing this on them because it makes us feel good about ourselves? Because see, that's not an act of service. That's a destructive act of selfishness. And again, we're just being deceived by our own emotions. Now, before I wrap up at this point, when I tell these kind of stories, I typically get questions from people going, "Okay, well, how am I supposed to handle situations like this? If I see someone who's able to, who's looks like they're in need, I don't want to be a jerk and not be helpful to them if they might need it, and I certainly don't want to be destructive to other people. So what am I supposed to do?" Well, it's a very simple, very common sense process that has three simple steps, but is very often ignored because, again, emotions get in the way and we don't think practically. So let's start with just covering the biblical principle that all of this is based on. Turn over to Proverbs chapter 18. Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 13. Because this is the concept that all of what I'm about to tell you is based on. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. You see, like if you think about the example of the guy I told you, in Big Sandy on the sidewalk there, what did he do? Well, he charged into the situation, trying to take charge and help a situation, ignored everything that was said to him. And see, that's where the problem starts. The simple three-step process is this. Number one, ask them if they want any assistance in the first place. That means you actually ask them a question. You don't just tell them they're about to receive it. Because let me tell you how these conversations typically play out. It normally sounds something like this. Let me help you with that. I'll get that for you. You don't need to do that. Here, let me help. Let me do this for you. Notice not a one of those is a question because they're not asking you if you want it. They're telling you you're about to receive it. And then when you say no, thank you, they're going to ignore everything you say because it goes like this. Here, let me get that for you. No, thank you. I've got it. Oh, I don't mind. I don't mind. I don't mind at all. No, thank you. I got it. Oh, I want to. I want to help. No, thank you. Oh, I insist. See, now your only option is to get so assertive that they cannot ignore you. And then they're oftentimes going to be offended because that's the first time they're going to hear you. And they're going to respond like, that came out of nowhere. That's because they were ignoring everything you said prior to that. So see, it's a simple three-step process. Ask them if they want any help in the first place. Number two, actually listen to the answer that they give you. Because if they say no, thank you, you've done your duty. It's that simple. You're now done. You offered, you were nice in it, they said no, thank you, you accept that. Now, if there's someone like myself who's dealt with a disabling condition all of their life, if they do need any help, they probably know exactly what help they need. And they can say, yes, you can help, and here's what you can do. And if they do that, by all means, fulfill that request. And then stop there. They ask you to do one thing, they did not ask you to take over the rest of their life. Because here's what typically happens. Someone does one thing and they go, they now need me to run the rest of their life. And I should watch everything that they do so I can anticipate their next move and then try to race ahead of them and manage it for them. Not only is this potentially dangerous, it's extremely annoying. So you don't want to do that. It's just, again, the simple three-step process. Ask them, listen to the answer, stop there. If something else comes up, start back at step number one. It's very easy. Again, just use logic and just a logic and rational reasoning with this. Step away from the emotion. It's not about appeasing your own emotions. It's about what's practically going to help. And you assess that by asking questions and listening to the answer. It's pretty common sense. And again, if you just step away from the emotion. But again, there's a number of ways where this whole concept of, again, appeasing our own emotions or others can get destructive in a number of contexts, even on an individual or even wide-scale basis. As we mentioned from the beginning, the Bible tells us in many cases, that we should be willing to help others, even particularly if they're in financial or other needs. If we have this world's goods and we see them in need, we should be helpful to them. I mean, that's very clearly talked about in the Bible. But Paul gives us some other principles that we need to make sure that we take into consideration that we're doing this in balance. So turn over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. We'll see another area Or we can cause a lot of harm if we think with our emotions and we don't step back and logically, analytically ask the question, does it do good? 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 6. But we command you, brethren, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that you withdraw from every brother who walks disorderly and not according to the tradition in which he received from us. Now, if we keep reading, we'll see what he's talking about as far as disorderly and what he means here. In verse 7, for you yourselves know how you ought to follow us, for we were not disorderly among you, nor did we eat anyone's bread free of charge, but work with labor and toil night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, not because we do not have authority, but to make ourselves an example of how you should follow us. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ, that they work in quietness and eat their own bread. But as for you, brethren, do not grow weary in doing good. And if anyone does not obey our word in the epistle, note that person and do not keep company with him, that we may be ashamed. You do not count him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. I notice, Paul's taking here what we might call kind of a hardcore approach. Because oftentimes we look at this and go, well, that's kind of mean. You're not helping out other people here who are in need. And he's not only going to the point of saying, don't just, subsidize bad behavior. He's talking about the concept of disfellowshipment here. You don't keep fellowship with people who act like this. Oftentimes we can look at that and go, well, that doesn't feel good. Well, that feels like it's kind of being mean. Well, think about this, because realize, as I love to point out when I talk about these scriptures, the same God who inspired Paul to write this is also the same God who instituted the third tithe system, who inspired the other statements, that we read here in Deuteronomy and in First John, that, if you're not willing to help out your fellow man, you don't have the love of God. He's not against helping people in legitimate need. He's not saying be hard-hearted and, and turn your back on people who have legitimate needs. That's not at all what he's getting at. What he's getting at here is not basically rewarding and subsidizing, bad behavior. Because sometimes you see people that are in, financial need, and it's not because of circumstances beyond their control. It's, sometimes it's an unwillingness to work, or just really bad decisions that they keep doing again and again, and it's not helpful in those situations if you reward people for bad behavior. I've over the years had to deal with a few situations like this. One in particular, an individual was out of work, been lost his job, for other circumstances, but in not only, would he have financial need, that, the church helped him out with third tithe assistance, but also tried to help this individual out in trying to find work. I've worked in the recruiting industry for almost 20 years now, so when I saw the situation, I'm like, okay, well, let's, help your immediate need with some financial assistance. But let's also see, well, what are you doing for your job search? Well, what avenues have you tried, and different philosophies of, things you could target and ways you could go about this. Well, after working with an individual for a while, you start figuring out, it's like, man, as fast as you can give them a suggestion of, you might try this avenue or try that avenue, his first focus is the list of excuses of why he can't do it. And you start realizing after a while, it's like, okay, this person just doesn't want to put any effort into finding work and doing something to support themselves. And you start realizing, okay, if you keep subsidizing this, you're rewarding negative behavior, and that doesn't wind up doing good, in the long run. That winds up creating problems. In fact, you can wind up causing monumental, catastrophic problems on a large scale with that type of philosophy. Where you initially start off with the thought of helping those in need, but you don't go about it in wisdom, and you wind up subsidizing negative behavior. And as a result, you can create monumental, catastrophic problems. And let me give you a good example of that. A very good way to illustrate this is to look at the welfare system in the United States as it's played out over the last 50 plus years, really since the 1960s, when the welfare system as we know it was really instituted and picked off from there. And a way to really kind of see clearly this particular subject is to particularly to look at one population of people. Not because I'm in any way picking upon them, but because of just all the factors involved, this really creates a clear picture of how this can be destructive rather than good. And that is if you look at the African American population in the US. Now, historically, I mean, it's just a very obvious fact of history. Prior to the 1960s, this was a group in American history that had been received a lot of discrimination, a lot of persecution in a lot of ways. I mean, for the first probably 100 years of our country's existence, there was slavery that affected many. And then even in the years after that, through what's commonly referred to as Jim Crow laws and others, there was lots of persecution that really, held this group of people down in many ways. However, if you look at statistics in the 1950s at, you might say the single parenthood rate of, if you're a child, born at that time, your likelihood of being born into a two-parent family versus a one-parent family. In the 1950s, if you compare the statistics, if you were a child born at that time, if you're an African American kid, you had a slightly greater chance of being born into a two-parent family than you did if you were a white kid. It was roughly about equal, but it was actually slightly better in your favor if you were an African American kid, because the family unit was solidly intact. But if you look at what happened when the welfare state, kind of got instituted and what's happened since then, there has been a monumental change. And here's what took place. You see, around that time frame, this is when the welfare system in the U.S. really got kicked off and instituted of the major programs that we've known in the last few decades. Not that there weren't other programs prior to that, but that's really when all this launched off. And when this change came about, there was a concentrated effort to specifically try to target this population, not from a predatory standpoint, but to try to be helpful. Because they looked at this and said, okay, this is a group of people that have been truly held down and discriminated against, and need some help to be brought up. And they would literally send social workers door to door through a lot of urban neighborhoods, that had heavy amounts of African American population, to try to educate people on the programs. But the programs were designed that basically you get more financial assistance if the father is not in the home. It basically incentivized the way the programs were designed, really wound up incentivizing single parenthood, is what took place. And basically there was a major push to try to, again, offer benefits here. Well, over time, what happened was you created an entire culture around these programs. And basically the single parenthood rate skyrocketed. If you compare that today with the statistics with what they were in the 1950s, today it's a 75% illegitimacy rate. The family structure is decimated. And again, you can directly tie this to, and again, you can chart it and statistically lay it out because again, it all picks up in the 1960s. Now, oftentimes when these kind of problems are talked about from, might say a social studies type of perspective, oftentimes you hear the term legacy of slavery, or legacy of racism in America and such. And again, it doesn't match up with the facts at all. And in terms of if you look at the dates of when this really took off and then history and just kind of chart it, it doesn't match at all. And to kind of illustrate this, I'd like to read a portion of an article by Dr. Thomas Sowell. This is taken from a website called thenationalreview.com. It's entitled "The Inconvenient Truth About Ghetto Communities' Social Breakdown." It was posted May 5th, 2015. And, and if you're not familiar with Dr. Sowell, he's basically retired now. He's well into his 80s, but he's a very well-known economist in the U.S., and he has his PhD in economics and also has done a lot of writing and research on social policy and such there. And he's African American himself. It's an interesting fact. Just a lot of where his research kind of focuses on that community as well, and policies in general. But let me just kind of read to you a portion of this article. He said the legacy of slavery argument is not just an excuse for inexcusable behavior in the ghettos. In a larger sense, it's an evasion of responsibility for the disastrous consequences of the prevailing social vision of our times and the political policies based on that vision over the past half century. Anyone who is serious about evidence need only compare the black communities as they evolved in the first 100 years after slavery with black communities as they evolved in the first 50 years after the explosive growth of the welfare state beginning in the 1960s. You would be hard pressed to find many ghetto riots prior to the 1960s, as we have seen in just the past year, much less in the 50 years since a wave of such riots swept across the country in 1965. We are told that such riots are a result of black poverty and white racism. But in fact, for those who still have some respect for facts, black poverty was far worse and white racism was far worse prior to 1960. But violent crime within black ghettos was far less. Murder rates among black males were going down, repeat down, during the much lamented 1950s, while it went up after much celebrated 1960s, reaching levels more than double of what they had been before. Most black children were raised in two-parent families prior to the 1960s, but today the great majority of black children are raised in one-parent families. Such trends are not unique to blacks nor even to the United States. The welfare state has led to remarkably similar trends among the white underclass in England over the same period. Just read Life at the Bottom by Theodore Dalrymple, a British physician who worked in a hospital in a white slum neighborhood. You cannot take any people of any color and exempt them from the requirements of civilization, including work, behavioral standards, personal responsibility, and all the other basic things that the clever intelligentsia disdain, without ruinous consequences to them and to society at large. Non-judgmental subsidies of counterproductive lifestyles are treating people as if they were livestock, to be fed and tended by others in a welfare state, and yet expecting them to develop as human beings have developed when facing the challenges of life themselves. One key fact that keeps getting ignored is that the poverty rate among black married couples has been in single digits every year since 1994. Behavioral matters and facts matter more than the prevailing social visions or political empires built on those visions. See, what he's getting at is if you subsidize negative behavior and you create a program that basically incentivizes single parenthood, where you'll get more financial benefits for having more and more illegitimate children, you don't wind up doing good. And see, oftentimes these things get justified from the perspective of, well, we need to be compassionate. We got to be giving to those that are poor and needy. Well, yes, we do need to be compassionate in giving to others, but we have to be wise about doing it. And it's easy for emotions to be played upon and think, well, we've got to continue subsidizing something that's leading to bad results, and that's wind up being destructive. And because we have to step back from a situation again, kind of away from all the emotion and ask the question, does it do good? In other words, how does this movie end? If we keep doing a particular, what's the end result? And what's it going to lead to in the long run? But sometimes if we just focus on the emotion at the moment of feeling good about ourselves or wanting to appease the emotions of others, we can wreak destruction in the name of doing good. Another easy example of this in terms of social policy is minimum wage laws. I'm sure you've probably seen over the last few years at times where areas of the country have pushed for a $15 an hour minimum wage, or they focus on fast food workers. These are the most vulnerable people. We need to pay them all $15 an hour. Well, you'll see lots of appeals to compassion, and caring about people in love when this is being done. But follow up, a year later when a policy like this is instituted, and here's what you're going to find. A lot of the businesses that employ these people, they're out of business now because they couldn't afford, to still make a profit, and pay these wages. Well, now these people aren't making more money, they're unemployed. Or you look at it again, like the whole thing started with the fast food, across the country. Having worked in recruiting for years, I looked at this and go, well, I already know how this movie's going to end. It wasn't long before you started seeing reports of, different chains looking into ways to automate, where you could then go into a fast food restaurant and have a little electronic kiosk where you could press the buttons and place your own order. And now they don't have to pay $15 an hour to, someone who's taking your order. You just place it yourself. Well, guess what just happened to the people they were trying to help with this wage increase? They don't have a job at all now. And again, this type of thing is very easy to know the outcome. It's been well documented for years, not only in this country but all over the world. I mean, if you look at the works of Thomas Sowell or Walter Williams, it's very easy to see how this has worked with great data. But very often this gets ignored because people are focused on the emotion. Well, we care and we're compassionate and we want to help others and all this, and the emotional, energy that gets run with this pushes the facts aside, and no one looks at what's the end result. Well, what does this result in? Because see, something that we have to be aware of is, again, this whole issue of confusing guilt with compassion, with our own emotions, because that justifies all manner of destructive behavior. And again, just to further back this up, let me quote from another article by Dr. Thomas Sowell. This is a portion of an essay he wrote called Compassion versus Guilt. It's from February 26, 1984. It says, quote, "Many of our attempts to share our good fortune with others, at home and abroad, have undermined the very efforts, standards, and values that make that good fortune possible. Trying to ease our own guilt feelings is very different from trying to advance the less fortunate. Deep thinkers who look everywhere for the mysterious causes of poverty, ignorance, crime, and war need look no further than their own mirrors. We are all born into this world poor and ignorant, and with thoroughly selfish and barbaric impulses. Those of us who turn out any other way do so largely through the efforts of others who civilized us before we got big enough to do too much damage to the world ourselves. But for these efforts, we might well be on welfare or in the penitentiary. We owe gratitude for those efforts, not guilt for those who didn't get them. We certainly cannot make it up to those without values, but by easing standards and letting them become a burden and threat to others. That is buying a good conscience or a good image with an IOU to be paid by somebody else. Those who want to share their good fortune can share their sources of that good fortune, the skills, values, discipline that mean productivity. Those who want to ease their burden of guilt should seek professional help at their own expense, not make policy at everyone else's expense." Because see, that's what oftentimes happens is we're driven by that emotion, and to feel good about ourselves, we can wreak havoc on other people. So then again, that's something we can apply this to lots of examples outside of the specific ones I've talked about. It's really the principle of this that we need to see the most that's important. Well, let's look at another application of this greater subject. Because we talked about situations where someone, is what I like to call the self-appointed hero. In other words, they appointed themselves into a role that no one really asked them to do and causes problems from that. Well, we can also be in roles where we were asked to be in and we were legitimately put into. But if we don't step back sometimes from our own emotions or the circumstances that are happening at the moment and look at the long-term picture, sometimes we can do damage with that as well. There's a good example of this over in Exodus chapter 18. Turn over to Exodus chapter 18. I'm looking at an example here of a conversation that Moses had with his father-in-law. So Exodus chapter 18, and we're going to start in verse 13. "And so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. So when Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that he did for the people, he said, What is this thing you are doing for the people? Why do you alone sit, and all the people stand before you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws." And Moses, his father-in-law, said to him, "The thing that you do is not good." See, what he's about to point out to him is it doesn't do good. In verse 18, "But you and these people who are with you will surely wear yourselves out, for this thing is too much for you. You are not able to perform it by yourself. Listen now to my voice, and I will give you counsel, and God will be with you. Stand before God and for the people, so that you may bring the difficulties to God. And you shall teach them the statutes and the laws, and show them the way in which they must walk, and the work they must do. Moreover, you shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it shall be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. And if you do this thing, and God commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all the people will also go to their place in peace. So Moses heeded the voice of his father-in-law, and did all that he had said. And Moses chose able men out of all of Israel, and made them rulers over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. So they judged the people at all times. The hard cases they brought to Moses, but they judged every small case themselves. Now notice here, Moses didn't self-appoint himself into this role. It wasn't like no one asked him to be in this role and he pushed himself into it. No, God showed up at the burning bush and told Moses, "I got a job for you." And he put him in this role of leading Israel. So he's legitimately in this role, but he's not going about it in a wise manner because as I love to put it, he's trying to run a marathon the way you'd run a sprint. If you ever think in terms of a sprint, it's about like a fourth of a mile. And the objective is, you run it as hard and as fast as you possibly can. Well, you can't run a 26-mile marathon like that. You'll die. Your body can't handle that. You're going to crash and burn before you ever finish the race. And see, so Moses looking at this thinking, well, it's my responsibility to serve the people. Well, yes, God put him in this role. That's true. But he doesn't step back from this and go, wait a minute, is this the best way to do this? And can I sustain this? Because he can't sustain this. And what Jethro's pointing out for him is this is a lose-lose for everybody because it's going to burn Moses out. It's going to frustrate the people. Nobody's going to win from this equation, from this whole scenario. So what he's pointing out to me is you're not going about this in a wise manner. This is a marathon. This is not a sprint, and you've got to run it like a marathon. And you don't have the resources to do all this on your own. You've got to delegate and go about this in another way. And today, again, if we look at the principle here of what he's doing, we can apply this in a number of ways. But when, in serving others, we've got to think about this from a wisdom standpoint. Again, how does this movie end? In a more practical way that you might apply this to, again, the lives of all of us as individuals. Because none of us have been given the job of leading a nation of Israelites and, taking on this massive, job that he has. But we can apply the same principle to ourselves. In a more common way that you might apply the principle is it's not unusual for church members sometimes to get in a situation where you've got a loved one, a close friend, or someone who's very ill or maybe terminally ill, and you're kind of primarily in a caretaker role taking care of that individual, and you would be loving and serving for them and provide what they need. Well, if this goes on for an extended period of time, this can get very taxing. And sometimes people get overcome with the emotion of it and think, well, this is my loved one I really care about. I need to be with them night and day, of every moment, to show them how much I care for them and such. Well, sometimes it's wiser to sit back again and look at this from the marathon rather than the sprint. And what I mean by this is if you take a concept from what's called hospice care, hospice oftentimes gets involved in a situation when an individual is, by their diagnosis, only has about less than 6 months of their life left to live. But an inherent part of hospice care is what they call respite care. In other words, they'll basically try to arrange to come in to, if family members of the person who's terminally ill, are constantly caring for them, they'll send in hospice people to kind of take care of them for a weekend, for example, and allow the primary caretakers to just get a break, to have some time away to just, kind of recharge their batteries and kind of get fueled up again. And it gives them a break. But so oftentimes people may be resistant to that, thinking, well, this is my loved one. I've got to be there with them all the time. Well, if you think about this, if you pace yourself where you're, physically and emotionally better able to be in the long run with them, that's better for all parties concerned. Because if you burn out under the strain of trying to take them, that affects your patience, that affects your ability to give them quality service, and it's negative for everybody concerned. So it's good at times to, again, think in terms of the marathon, not the sprint. The concept I like to kind of express this in a lot of times is, if you've ever taken a commercial air flight, when you first get on the plane, one of the things they'll always do before they take off is they give you the safety presentation. Now, if you're like a lot of people, you may be reading a magazine or checking your phone or talking to the person next to you and you're totally ignoring them. But if you pay attention to the safety demonstration, one of the things that's always addressed in that presentation is what happens in the scenario where the oxygen supply in the plane gets compromised, and these oxygen masks fall down from the top of the ceiling of the plane. They always give you the instructions. If you're an adult and you're traveling with a small child, make sure you put the mask on yourself first and then the child. Well, see, emotionally, if we're thinking emotionally, we typically go the other way. Why we need to do the child first? Well, think it through logically. If the reason this would be happening is because the oxygen supply in the plane's been compromised, or there's reason to believe so. Well, in a worst case scenario, if to the lack of oxygen, people start passing out, if the adult passes out because they don't have a mask on, now who's going to take care of the child? And a small child is probably not going to have the mental presence to put the mask on the adult after they passed out. If it goes the other way around, though, if the adult puts theirs on first and the child, for lack of oxygen, passes out, the next thing the adult's going to do is put the mask on the child and take care of them. The child's going to be revived. We're probably all going to be okay. You see, it's a logical, analytical approach to the situation. It's not what feels good to my emotions at the moment. It's what does good if we look at it, practically and analytically. Now, to cover one last point, another way that sometimes we get ourselves into trouble in taking on the problems of other people, or and again, out of good intentions, is sometimes we can just take them on emotionally in terms of worrying about other people that we really care about. And sometimes the point of just worrying ourselves sick, because there are times where we may really care about someone who's in a bad situation, and we can personalize that so much that we literally make ourselves sick by worrying about it. And the Bible covers an important concept here about worry. Turn over to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Now, the focus here is an individual worrying about their own circumstances, but we can also apply the principles here to, again, worrying about people we care about, our loved ones or our friends. Let's start in verse 25. It says, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, and what you will eat and what you will drink, nor about your body and what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. And are you not more value than they? Which of you worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, and how you grow, and how they grow, and they neither toil nor spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? Therefore do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." See, God's here, Christ is here explaining to us that, God's got everything under control. He's going to take care of us. And even though we may not see the answer, if we're relying upon him, he's going to take care of our basic needs. Well, see, not only do we need to apply this concept to ourselves, we also have to apply this concept to others, and others that we care about. They're in circumstances that we may be worrying about their good. We can pray and ask, God to take care of them, but we've got to trust him to do that. You see, sometimes we can internalize other people's problems, again, almost kind of putting ourselves, as if we have control over it, as if we're able to solve these situations, when in reality, we can't. We're really just worrying ourselves over something we have absolutely no control over. And again, does that do good? No, it just destroys your own mental and physical health and is negative to everybody. we have to have faith in God that He will take care of circumstances that we have no control over. And see, this type of thing can particularly become a problem for people that are in, you might say, in the helping professions. And what I mean by that is, jobs like they work in healthcare, or they work in social work, or in ministry, or other things of that nature, where their job is to serve and to care for others. And one of the problems that people can kind of naturally fall into, because oftentimes people with personalities that get into those careers are people who really care, who have big hearts and who really want to identify with other people's problems and want to help them. But sometimes they go overboard, and they take on things, personally that they really can't control, and it becomes a negative thing. And in fact, I remember myself a few years ago, I had a good friend he's an elder as well in a Church of God organization, and had been a local elder for many years. And the organization that he worked for offered him the chance to become full time in the ministry, and he took that. And we were just kind of talking about this whole transition of what he was going through at the time, and just knowing what a big-hearted individual he was. One of the things I mentioned to him was this particular concept. I said, one of the things you're going to have to look out for is that you don't try to own the outcome of other people's choices. And I said, because if you do, that's going to kill you. I said, because you can't control what other people decide and what they do in their own life. I said, if you're in a role like ministry, you're trying to teach them, you're trying to counsel at times and to help people through difficult situations. But sometimes you give them good advice and they just still choose to make bad decisions, and they still go down bad roads that you can't stop them from doing. And as I was mentioning to him, I said, all you can do is take responsibility for doing the best you can to help others of what you can control. I said, if you try to take on owning other people's choices, that will kill you. But particularly if you're in a job like that where you're constantly facing those situations. Because the point I was kind of making to him is God doesn't even take ownership of our choices. I said, he takes on responsibility of taking care of us and tries in every way he can to encourage and push us in the right direction. But he leaves the ultimate choice up to us, and he makes us accountable for it. So turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 30. Deuteronomy chapter 30, and we're going to start in verse 15 here. See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. That I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, that you may live and multiply. And the Lord your God will bless you in the land which you go to possess. But if your heart turns away, so that you do not hear, and you are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I announce to you today that you shall surely perish. And you will not prolong your days in the land which you cross over the Jordan to go in to possess. I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, and that you may obey his voice, and that you may cling to him, and he is your life and the length of your days, that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. Now notice here, God makes it very clear, I'm giving you a choice. I'm setting before you life and death. I'm trying to teach you the right way. I'm pleading with you to choose the right way and try to push you in that direction. But if you choose wrong and you choose death, I'm going to let you, and I'm going to warn you against it. But if you choose that, that's your choice and you're going to have to live with it, And see, God doesn't even try to take on our own choices. And we can't make the mistake of trying to put ourselves, thinking that we can somehow own other people's choices, because we can't. We can only take responsibility for assisting them where we can, and being able, if we have resources and things, again, to help them in productive ways, well, then by all means, we should do that, but again, we don't want to take it from the responsibility, from the point of view that we take responsibility for the outcome of their choices, because that's not healthy for anyone involved. Again, that may make us feel good. It may make us feel like a hero at the moment, but it's not going to do good, because we all have to stand or fall on our own choices. I mean, if we think of our society today loves the victim idea. I'm a victim of, fill in the blank, and I'm not responsible for my choices. Read Ezekiel 18 sometime. God does not go for that. He said, the soul that sins, it shall die. In other words, every individual stands or falls on their own choices, and we have to own that. Brethren, as I've covered throughout this sermon, you know, we all have a responsibility as Christians to be giving to our fellow man. If we have the resources, if we have, the ability to help them in their time of need, then by all means we should do that. But again, we have to also exercise wisdom and solid biblical principles in how we do that. Because if we just look at this from the standpoint of we just want to do good to everybody and we charge out, thinking, well, this will do good because it makes me feel good about me, oftentimes we can be very destructive to other people. We need to stop and look at this from wisdom. And again, one of the keys where we often go wrong is we let our emotions deceive us. We get caught up in the emotion of the moment of appeasing our own emotions or the emotions of others, and that leads us astray. So what we always need to do in these situations is, again, take a step back from the emotion, logically and analytically look at the subject. And the key question you want to ask yourself, does this do good? In other words, what is the ultimate result? What is this going to lead to, particularly in the long run? Because sometimes we may think, well, this will solve some pain in the moment. And sometimes that may feel good for all parties in the short term. But again, if you're looking at it in the long run, does it do good for everyone in the long run? Because realize that's God's definition of love. It's not always about just making us feel good or making others feel good. It's about doing good in the long run. So yes, as Christians, as we go forward from this Sabbath, let's take seriously our responsibility to help others, to help our fellow man in what other ways that we can, because again, that's an important thing of being a Christian. But let's make sure that we do it with wisdom. And again, the pivotal question to always ask ourselves is, does it do good?